Another good neckline treatment involving bias is a single bias binding. First off, let's indicate a wrong side on our neckline, and then you'll take a 1.5 inch strip of bias, and we want to start by marking a line 1/4 inch from one of the edges. We'll be using the iron and pressing this 1/4 inch under before we sew. After marking a 1/4 inch line on one long edge of your binding, you'll want to use the iron to press that 1/4 inch under. So just carefully fold it up bit by bit, being extra sure that you are not stretching or pulling the bias in any way as you press the 1/4 inch down. To stitch our single bias to the neckline, you want to have the right side of your neckline facing up, and you'll place your binding against it, aligning not the edge that we pressed with the iron, but the other raw edge with the neckline. And we're going to be sewing this along our neckline with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Begin with the back stitch. And come forward, gently bending your neckline into a straight edge. Also being sure that you are not stretching either the neckline or the binding. Finish with a back stitch. After sewing, come in with your fabric shears and trim the excess bias away at either end. Then use the iron to press the bias upwards. The bias and the seam allowance will both be going in the same direction, which is away from the body of the garment. And be sure as you do this that you don't disturb that 1/4 inch fold that we pressed in the very beginning. After pressing, have the wrong side of your neckline facing up. And starting at the beginning, we're going to be taking our pre-pressed folded edge of bias and folding it down so that we are aligning our fold exactly with our stitch line. The fold should be sitting directly on top of our stitches rather than beyond it or lower than the stitches, the way we do in a French bias binding. So you want to perfectly match the fold with the stitch line. And then we'll be stitching our bias down by edge stitching, so 1/16 of an inch above the fold. And in a perfect world, the opposite side, which is the right side of the garment, should actually have a perfect edge stitch 1/16 of an inch above the seam as well. So right here, I'm aligning the fold with the inside edge of my presser foot and edge stitching. Have your fold positioned exactly on top of the stitches. When completed, your wrong side should look like this, edge stitched just above the fold, and the right side should appear to be stitched the same distance directly above the seam. After sewing, we'll want to press our binding to help it sit a little bit flatter. It may tend to want to look like it's sticking up like a wall, so we need to sort of smooth it out and coerce the extra fabric inward along the deepest parts of the curve. So just kind of bend it inward and gently come in with your iron bit by bit. Just helping the excess fabric settle inward. After pressing, present the sample in your notebook with the wrong side facing up. A railroad zipper is one of the most standard and basic forms of zipper installations that involves the zipper being centered right in the middle of a seam. We're going to take 2 rectangles of fabric and begin by indicating a wrong side on both. Next, we'll want to place them with the right sides together. Then we'll want to bring our zipper over and check our length. I have it positioned so that the zipper pull is facing towards me. And we want to begin by matching the very top edges of the zipper tape with the edge of the fabric. The fabric portions of the zipper are called the tape, and the plastic parts that interlock in the center are called the teeth. So I have the ends of my zipper tape lined up with the ends of my fabric, and I want to look down at this end of the zipper where the metal stopper is. We're going to look for where that stopper is and then go about 1/4 of an inch further than it and mark on the edges of our fabric a little notch. This is a pretty small sample and is not that much larger than the length of the zipper I'm using. So just know that the portion below the zipper is what would normally continue into the rest of the garment. So we're going to be having our seam be closed up for this portion, and then from the notch and onward is where we will set our zipper. Starting from the portion of our seam that's meant to stay closed where we're not actually placing the zipper, we're going to begin sewing with our normal 2.5 millimeter stitch length, and I'm using a seam allowance of 3/4 of an inch. My machine does not have a 3/4 guideline on the throat plate, so I've gone ahead and created one for myself with a post-it note. I'll start near the beginning of the fabric with a back stitch, and then come forward, sewing at 3/4 of an inch. Here's my notch that we created. This notch is meant to indicate the very bottom of the zipper, just a little bit below where that stopper is. So I'm going to sew exactly up to where the notch is, still keeping my 3/4 inch seam allowance. From this point, I'm going to do a back stitch, just 3 or 4 stitches backward, and then forward again, back to the level that the notch is at. Without removing my fabric from the machine, now I'm going to change my stitch length to a basting stitch, which means a very long stitch length because this is going to be temporary. So set your machine's stitch length to about 5 millimeters or whatever its highest number is. And with that longer stitch, I'm going to continue sewing all the way up to the top, still keeping my 3/4 inch seam allowance consistent. And when you reach the end, no need to finish with a back stitch. After sewing, you should see that the portion beyond the zipper that is going to stay closed is sewn with a normal stitch length, with that section being sealed with a back stitch at either end. But then, in the portion where a zipper is going to sit, we have sewn with a longer basting stitch because this is going to be temporary, and we'll remove this basting stitch after the zipper is sewn in. At this point, the next step will be to simply press our seam allowance open. So run your iron right over the top of the seam. And then spread apart the 2 seam allowances. And press. First from the wrong side. And then for an even deeper press, also get at it from the right side. While the railroad zipper looks nicest with the majority of it sewn while our seam is closed, we're not able to sew it this way at the very top where our zipper pull is. So we're going to come in with a seam ripper and simply remove maybe just the first 2 inches of basting stitch. So you can either cut the threads or just simply pluck them open, just about that far. While railroad zippers are traditionally sewn using a zipper foot, which allows you to get super close to the zipper teeth, this type of zipper also comes out just as nicely sewing 1/4 inch over. So if you have a foot that is 1/4 inch wide, you can actually use that as a guide as well for sewing the railroad zipper. Our fabric is going to be on top of the zipper as we sew, but before we do, I just want to indicate the placement when we're sewing. We're going to be sewing so that the foot is coasting along in the groove next to the zipper teeth. The foot can never sit on top of the teeth and sew properly, but you're almost going to use it like a bumper and let the zipper teeth just ride along next to the edge of the foot. This technique is used whether you're using a zipper foot or a 1/4 inch wide presser foot. To begin the sewing process, I want to start by unzipping my zipper and make sure I have the right side of the zipper facing up. Then I'll come in with my fabric sample, which should also have the right side facing up. And I'm going to begin on the right side of the zipper, meaning the right versus left side of it. So I'm going to take this corner of my fabric and place it right on top of the corresponding side of the zipper. When you go to line everything up, your goal is to be matching the top edge of your fabric with the ends of the zipper tape. And you want the fold that was left behind from the iron to be sitting exactly on top of the teeth and the little section of fabric coil that's at the top. While everything is positioned like this, place it under the presser foot, and you should even see a little bit of an excess off to this side, as the foot should be resting in the groove next to the coil. We'll start with a back stitch. And as I continue forward, I want to make sure that my zipper teeth along this side are perfectly matched with the fold of the fabric, and I can feel that the presser foot is sitting in that groove next to the fabric. But we're only going to sew for the first couple inches or so with our fabric and zipper in this position. Once we get to the point that we had finished opening up our seam, we're going to stop, being sure that the needle is down in the fabric. Now I can raise my presser foot, reach for my zipper pull, and close the zipper to get it back up to the top. Now the zipper pull is out of our way as we continue, because you can't really sew past the zipper pull without creating a weird wobble in the stitch. Once I'm at this point though, for the section of my seam that is still closed with the basting stitch, I want to center that seam exactly on the middle of my zipper teeth, which are now closed. I could even feel on either side of the zipper with my fingernails to be able to tell that the zipper is perfectly centered on the seam. And this is the placement you will want to keep up as you continue sewing down the length of the zipper. So I'm going to hold it in place and just feel the foot riding along on the side of the zipper. Do it in small sections, and if you need to reach underneath to get a better view, you can roll the seam downwards on top of the zipper and hold it in place for the next section. Check underneath, roll it forward. Now when we get to the bottom here, we have the little metal stopper, and you always have to be extremely careful to not sew on top of the metal, or else you will break your needle. Your machine is capable of carefully sewing over the plastic section, but you have to be sure to not hit the metal with your needle. Our goal is going to be to sew just a little bit further than where the metal stopper is, which we'll be able to tell by feel. So right here I could feel that's where the bottom of my metal is, and I'm just going to come about 1/8 of an inch further than that with my stitches. And at this point you'll stop with the needle down in your fabric, raise the presser foot and rotate everything 90 degrees so that now we can sew across the bottom portion of the zipper. We're going to sew across just a few stitches until we get to the same placement on the other side. If you're unsure of this, after you've kind of reached that general area, stop with your needle down, raise the foot, rotate, and then lower the foot. And we want to check from this direction, is the foot sitting in the correct spot? At this point, my presser foot is sitting on top of the zipper teeth and the stopper by a little bit, which means that I actually need to go back and advance forward probably just one more stitch. So I'm going to turn the hand wheel to come forward just one more, and now I'll check it again, with the goal being that, yes, we finally reached the position where now the presser foot is riding along in the groove next to the zipper again. And now I can sew up the other side of the zipper with the same placement. When I get just a little further than the point where my seam had been opened up from the very beginning, I'm going to stop again with the needle down, raise the presser foot, and unzip the zipper to get it to be now behind the point that I'm at. And then you'll just want to carefully position the remaining portion by matching the fold of your fabric with the zipper teeth. Should be perfectly aligned along this side, and continue sewing with that same spacing all the way to the very end and finish with a back stitch. After sewing your zipper, the final step will be to close it completely and then come to the remaining portion of your seam that is still sewn shut with the basting stitches. You're going to use a seam ripper, and with the little red ball end pointed down, because that's the safety end, you're going to just carefully run it right through the center of your seam, cutting those basting stitches open. Clean up any loose little thread bits that are still hanging out in the seam. And then you can have your aha moment of grabbing your zipper pull and opening up your perfectly sewn railroad zipper. Present your zipper in your notebook with the right side facing up. A lapped zipper is an asymmetrical zipper installation that offsets the zipper to one side so it can be hidden under a lap of fabric. Even though I'm working with a pretty long zipper, we're going to assume that our zipper opening is 7 inches. We'll start by indicating a wrong side on our 2 rectangles of fabric and then place them with the right sides together. From the bottom edge of your fabric, along the long edge, measure upwards and mark 7 inches. We're going to assume that our zipper will go into this 7-inch section, and everything beyond that is the remaining portion of the seam which will stay closed. We're going to begin sewing on the end of our seam that will stay closed, as opposed to the 7-inch section with the zipper. And we'll be sewing all the way down at 3/4 of an inch seam allowance. I want to sew this closed section of the seam with a standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length, but where the zipper is going to go, we will be changing it to a basting stitch. So I'll start at the beginning with a back stitch and continue forward just until I'm up to the mark I made, which is meant to indicate the bottom of the zipper closure. At this point, we'll sew backwards, just 3 or 4 stitches, and then forward again to the mark. Now for the remaining portion where the zipper is going to go, you're going to change your stitch length to a long basting stitch because this will be a temporary stitch. So use about a 5 millimeter as your stitch length and continue sewing at 3/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way to the end. When sewn, the portion of the seam that will stay closed should look like this, with a standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length and a back stitch at either end of that section. And then the portion from our mark up to the end where the zipper will be getting installed should have a long basting stitch length. Use your iron to first just press right over the top of your stitches, and then you will press your seam allowances open. After pressing, you're going to remove the basting or long stitch that was sewn for the portion of the seam that the zipper is going to sit in. So unfold your sample and look for where your back stitch left off and becomes the basting stitch. And using a seam ripper, you'll remove that portion of the seam. Usually after you break the beginning of the thread, you can slide it out and then just check on the other side to remove the bobbin thread as well. At this point, the portion of the seam in which the zipper will sit should be completely opened up, and the iron will have left a nice little crease exactly on our 3/4 inch seam allowance line. Next, take your zipper and unzip it completely to open it up. With the right side of the zipper facing up and the right side of your fabric facing up, place your sample on top of the zipper. And we're going to be pinning the right, as in right versus left side of our zipper first. The left side will get a different technique. Reach behind where this fold was pressed to grab your seam allowance, and you will unroll a generous 1/8 of an inch from that seam allowance. So you should be able to see the crease that was left by the iron, but now as you grab from behind, you are creating a new crease, a large, generous 1/8 of an inch over from the original iron crease. And that new crease that you're creating, you will match it up to the edge of your zipper teeth. So I can align the fold with the edge of the coil, as well as matching the top edge of my fabric with the top edge of the zipper tape. And place a pin perpendicular to that edge. We're going to continue this technique working our way down the length of the zipper. It helps if I even fold this side back, and you just want to continue to reach underneath and unroll that extra 1/8 of an inch of seam allowance. You want to be sure that you keep this extra bit consistent and even in width as we continue down and pin in place. When you get to the very bottom here, it can be very easy for that extra to sort of disappear back into the original bottom of the seam. So you need to be sure that at the very bottom, you still have about an 1/8 of an inch unrolled. It helps if we have this folded back over to the side so that you can see the little step here from the original seam over to the edge of the zipper teeth. Make sure you place your very last pin down at the bottom, exactly at that point. After pinning your generous 1/8 new fold against the right side of the zipper teeth, it'll be time to stitch all the way down on that side of the zipper. This is best done using a zipper foot, which will allow us to pretty much edge stitch against this fold. However, if you don't have a zipper foot, you can do this with a standard presser foot. The only downside is that your stitch line on this side of the zipper, which would normally be hidden, will be visible from the outside of the garment in your finished zipper. So, if possible, using a zipper foot is preferred for this step. I'm going to begin at the top, a little ways down from the top actually, to allow for a back stitch. And if you're using a zipper foot, the foot should end up riding along next to the zipper teeth. It should just coast along it like a guide. And that should leave your needle sewing about a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch over from the fold. As you come towards the very bottom, sew as far down as you can without stitching onto the other side that's folded back towards you. And then finish by going in reverse for a few stitches. After sewing, your stitch should look about like this, sewn about 1/8 of an inch over from the fold of the fabric, which is aligned with the side of the zipper teeth. After sewing the first side of the zipper, you'll then want to go and close the zipper completely. And in doing so, notice how when I lay the left side of the fabric on top, the zipper is now nicely hidden under that lap of fabric. This is what we were going for. For the next portion, we need to make ourselves a little guideline down here at the bottom. So I'm going to find the point at which my zipper opening ends. And from right there, I want to draw a line 90 degrees over from the seam, crossing over the actual zipper. Then I want to feel for the other side of the zipper by kind of digging my fingernail into it a little bit, and then use your pencil to draw on the opposing side of the zipper so that we have a little cross mark right here. This corner is going to indicate an important pivot point as we sew the next step. Before sewing, we'll want to pin the next side of the zipper in place. What you'll want to be looking for as you pin is matching this fold of the fabric with not your stitch line here, but the original crease line left by your iron from when you pressed this seam open. It should be that generous 1/8 of an inch over from the fold that is sewn against the zipper. So that line right there, in which you may be able to still see some needle perforations, is the point at which you will match the fold as you close up the right side of the seam. So with those two lines positioned in place, you're going to pin perpendicular to the zipper. Start your pins on the right side of the zipper and feel that it dips completely underneath the zipper teeth and comes up, catching the fold on the opposing side. You don't need a ton of these pins, as overpinning could cause you to have a wonky, wavy zipper, but maybe every 2 inches or so is good. So again, I want to look for that line and then roll my fold right on top of it and pin. And then have your last pin be just a little ways below the closed zipper pull. We're going to stop and adjust the zipper as we get to the top, because if we try to sew around the zipper pull in that position, it will give us a wave in our stitch line. With my zipper foot still on, I'm going to come into that little mark we just made, and the corner of the pencil mark is exactly where we want to begin. So turn the hand wheel to lower your needle exactly into that little cross mark before we begin. And we want to have the fabric positioned so that the zipper is actually going off sideways. Our first step is going to be to sew backwards on our pencil line exactly to the seam right here. So holding down your back stitch control, carefully go backwards, and you will be sewing over the plastic portion of the zipper, but that shouldn't be too much of a problem. Stop right when you reach the seam, and then come forward again to the exact point at which we started. With your needle down, raise your presser foot, rotate your fabric, and you want to feel as you lower the presser foot again and have the zipper aimed towards you, that your zipper foot is sitting next to the zipper teeth. You want to feel that it's nestled right into that groove of the side of the zipper. And once you're positioned, you will sew forward, following the groove of the zipper the whole way up. When you come up to the top where you're almost at the point of your zipper pull, you'll want to stop with your needle down, raise the presser foot, and grab the zipper pull to unzip it and get it off behind you and out of the way. Then check underneath to line up your fabric and zipper to follow a straight line of the exact spacing in which you were already sewing, and just continue all the way up to the very tippy top, where you will then finish with a back stitch. Your completed lapped zipper should look like so. Place your zipper in your sewing notebook with the right side facing up.